see if we get there today. I thought it would be cool to like just start building our knowledge of materials and making materials. And so I just made like, we're just going to look at how you can make something like this. As you can see, there's like a few different materials going on here. There's like a black rough thing, and then there's kind of like a silver thing underneath it. So up until this point, what's the one way, if you think back to the Enterprise, that you like put multiple materials on the same object? Can somebody kind of remind us how you get multiple materials on one object? Maybe it's an obvious question. Let me go to cycles render. You know, in your material setting, you just start adding with the plus button like a few different materials. We'll call this material, well, something, and then I just like to keep it organized. You don't have to do that. And then something else. And by default, your material is going to be this first one, which is called something. And then let's give it, you know, red. And in our settings, I'm going to also make it red. I'm just going to copy, hover over that field, Control C, hover over this field, Control V. Let me turn on my screencast keys. So by default, it's that first one, and then this one will be the white. So you go into edit mode, and you assign this face to be something else. So that's the one way we've learned to make multiple materials. But there's another way which has its own advantages, and it gives you results like this. Because if you look at that geometry, you know, you're not going to have faces that curve and like little circles there. You can't assign anything. So the other way to do multiple materials is you build it all within one node. So let me just have a cube here. And we're only going to have one material, and we'll call it like something awesome. And if you go into your node editor, you know, we just have our regular diffuse plugged in, and you can see right here, here's our diffuse. So let's say we wanted something like red. I'm going to go into rendered mode. But we want to mix it in an awesome way with another texture or another shader. So I'm going to add another diffuse, and like let's say we wanted this one to be like yellow. So as you can see, we have our red one and our yellow one, but we need to blend these somehow. So there's a shader called a mix shader. So I'm in just Shift A, I look for mix, and I see the M is underlined. So if you start struggling, like where is that mix shader? If I just hit M, like the mix shader pops up. So you can see we have these three sockets. We have this socket and this socket. So let's just plug the red one in here. Notice the green goes to green, and we'll plug the yellow one in there. So what we have here is this value from 0 to 1, and if you just drag it between, you can start seeing these two textures. So this socket, this bottom socket right here, this is the 0 value, and this socket, the one below it, is the 1 value. Does that kind of make sense? So I'm on full 1. So basically, if we can figure out a way to tell that this object, I want some parts to be 0 and some parts to be 1, then we can start basically mixing this texture. If you're just using the slider, all you can do is blend it. So you could use a picture or something, but let's just for now, let's see if we use a checkerboard texture. So Blender has a few built-in textures, like checker and brick. Some of them you have to UV unwrap your object before, but let's just use this checkerboard for now. So white is 1. And if I change this to black, black is 0. So if I plug this into the top, because this is basically, this node is just looking for values between 0 and 1, and it can have decimal points. So if I plug that into the top of it, I've now, without making multiple materials over here, made something kind of awesome. It's not that awesome, but you can start seeing how you can mix textures. So let's take this to a more interesting example, like this ball. So how do you, this ball is starting to get into the awesome realm. And let's just kind of look at the materials real quick. So let's pretend that this bottom part right here, this was like one diffuse shader. And then let's pretend this one was the other diffuse shader. Let's pretend this one was the red. And this one was the yellow. And all I'm doing is plugging that red one, plugging it into this bottom value and plugging this yellow one into that value. And then they have a mix. And I used a picture for the mix. So let's see if we can rebuild it. And it ends up with something like this. But notice it's not just a simple diffuse shader. I used a principled shader for this one, and it's metallic, and I have roughness, and I have some bump map. And then this one is I think they call it dielectric if it's not metallic. So it's kind of rough and rubbery and also has some bump mapping going on. And then I used this picture to define, well, the blacks are going to be this rubbery thing, and the whites are going to be this metallic-y thing. So then you can just drag this slider and start getting different results because I'm changing what's black and what's white, I'm basically changing the contrast, and now you can get different results. So let me just walk through how to make something like that. Make sure you're in cycles render, and you can add a sphere. I'm going to subdivide my sphere once. I'm actually going to add two subdivisions. So in view and render it says 2, and then we can just leave that. Let me add my screencast keys. So go into node editor, and I'm just going to change this lamp to a sun just so we get some higher visibility on our ball. So let's make that smooth shading as well. Okay, so new material, something awesome. So really, just start out. You could start out with a principled, think of it as layering texture. So I want to build that like rubbery thing. So I'm going to make this kind of black, and I have these textures available in Blackboard. So what's wrong here? This image texture isn't showing up. Why is that? Does anybody know? Well, remember, we didn't unwrap that ball at all, so by default it's looking for something to unwrap. But if you don't want to unwrap it, you can input this texture coordinate node, and if you just plug the generated into there, you're starting to get something, but it's a flat plane being stretched over a sphere. So let's change this to a box, and you can start to see some seams right here. Basically it's thinking it's like here's the box. Does that kind of make sense? Well, it doesn't make sense when you do it. But so it's basically, so there's going to be a few seams, but that texture is so complicated that you barely see it. But you could blend the seam a little bit by, right here is a seam, I think. Or maybe right there is a seam. So you can blend the seam a little bit. Anyways, let's plug this into the roughness. And now I'm getting something kind of cool. Let's add a vector, a bump, and I'm going to plug this into the height. And just to kind of see, that's way too much bump, so let's put that by half, 0.5, and plug it into the normal. So now we have well, I'm going to do that 0.1 maybe. So now we have a material. But let's not stop there. Let's add a new principled shader. And we'll make this fully metallic. And really we can just copy these. So I'm going to duplicate them with Shift D and plug it into the normal, plug this into the roughness. And maybe if you want to vary the roughness a bit, bring out a converter and a color ramp, and I'm just Control-Shift clicking with the node wrangler. So anything black is going to be smooth, anything white is going to be rough. So let's bring up the roughness a bit and maybe drop that a little bit. And so now we're getting that. So once again, how do we mix between these two materials? So we add a shader, a mix node. I just hit M because I didn't want to search for it, but it was in there right here. And once again, because the M is underlined, I just had to hit M. We'll plug this one into there. So we'll plug it basically into the 0 value slot, and we'll plug this one into the 1 value. And so here are our two materials. And let's use, we need to plug something into here. And we have this image texture right here. So I'm going to add a converter, a color ramp, and anything black is going to be this rubbery thing. Anything white will be the silvery thing. And to make it more interesting, you could use this double arrow thing to flip. It basically just flips where the black and white are. So let's make, I want mostly black and a little bit of like white. So this is going to be how our material is mixed. Plug it into the shader, and there we go. So that's almost done, I would say. One thing you could do, there's this, if we just drag this color into the displacement, Blender will add some fake bump mapping on top of the whole material. And what it's going to do is anything white, it's going to make pop out. Anything black, it'll push in. But let's think about this for a second. Our black is going to be the rubbery stuff, and I kind of imagine that would be on top. So let's add a math node in the converter, or we could just stick with our color ramp node because that's an easy one to remember. So here it is, right? It's this being plugged into this equals the same thing, but if we flip it, we start getting something else. So everything white will pop out, everything black will recede in. And let's see what it looks like if we throw that in. Now we added some bump to it. The one thing though is like this white is pushing out by 1, black is receding in by 1. So if you kind of bring those values closer to the center, you know, basically bringing them closer to 0.5, then it kind of tones down that bump a little bit, which I think helps. Okay, so you guys are just gonna try messing around with. It's in the classes in the Blackboard in lessons. Let's just see how this looks. But that is another way that you can mix materials, and I think that looks fine. I mean, it has its own personality. It's not just like I assigned a texture to like that quadrant. All right.